A humble rancher lived alone for years, until 3 beautiful single mothers asked him for refuge. The rancher's name was Caleb Wren. He had long ago traded the din of city life for the solemn hush of his sprawling lands, where the whispering grass stretched past the horizon and the sky seemed to bow down and kiss the earth each dusk. Caleb was a man of few words, and the locals respected his quiet strength. They said he had known a sorrow so deep it had hollowed out everything except his devotion to the land. On an evening steeped in violet twilight, Caleb returned from mending a broken fence to find a dust-caked sedan parked by his porch. The engine ticked with exhausted heat. Inside were 3 women and their children, all of them looking as though they'd driven across half the continent with hope as their only fuel. The first woman to step out was tall and striking, with a long auburn braid and fierce, clear eyes. "Please," she said before he could even ask her name. "We don't mean trouble. We need a place to stay for a little while." Caleb had never been one to refuse a soul in need. His father had taught him that a man's worth was measured not in acres or coin, but in how he treated strangers. Still, something about the way these women looked at him, an aching mix of desperation and defiance, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. He nodded, wordless, and gestured for them to come inside. By the light of the kitchen lamp, he learned their names: Lila, the auburn-haired mother of a shy, dark-eyed boy named Micah; Grace, whose 2 daughters clung to her skirts as though they were part of her own body; and Evelyn, a quiet woman with a bruised cheek and a newborn asleep against her shoulder. No one spoke much that first night. Caleb showed them the spare rooms he'd never bothered to furnish beyond the basics. He brewed coffee and listened to the wind batter the windows, aware that their silence carried more stories than any words could. Over the following days, the ranch began to change in ways Caleb hadn't foreseen. Where there had been only his boots by the door, now there were small shoes lined up in crooked rows. He would return from the far pasture to find Grace teaching her girls to braid rope, or Lila coaxing Micah to feed the chickens. One afternoon, as he worked in the barn, he heard Evelyn singing. The tune was soft and haunting, a lullaby in a language he didn't know. Her voice drifted through the wide gaps in the boards and wrapped around him like a memory he'd misplaced. At dusk, he sat on the porch and watched the women tending the small garden plot he'd never bothered to plant. He realized the place looked less like a monument to loneliness and more like something alive, a haven, maybe. Still, questions hung between them, unspoken but heavy. Where had they come from? What drove them to seek out a stranger in the middle of nowhere? Caleb wasn't sure he wanted to know, for fear the answer would shatter this fragile peace. But the truth has a way of finding its voice, even in the most remote corners of the world. Late one night, Lila came to sit across from him at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands restless around a chipped mug. "You must be wondering," she began, her voice breaking, "why we showed up here. Why we didn't go to the police or anyone else." He waited. "We were all in the same shelter in Larkridge," she said. "All of us, trying to start over. But the man I was hiding from, he found out. He threatened to take Micah. Evelyn, Lila stopped and drew in a shaking breath. "She's the reason we got out. She heard him talking to someone. She woke us in the middle of the night, and we just ran." Caleb stared down at his calloused hands. In his chest, something old and grief-stricken stirred, something that recognized their terror. "My father used to say no place is safer than where you're willing to defend it," he said finally. "If you need to stay, this land is yours as long as you want it." For the first time, Lila's eyes held a flicker of relief. In the days that followed, he saw the women begin to reclaim small pieces of themselves. Evelyn took to walking the fence lines with the baby in a sling, murmuring to her in that same lilting language. Grace started painting again. She covered the plain walls of her room in wild, colorful swirls that made Caleb smile every time he passed by. But even as the ranch grew warmer, there were moments when shadows fell long across the fields. Vehicles appeared on the distant road, slowing as if to study the house before driving on. Lila's shoulders would tense, and Micah would creep close to her side, eyes darting to the windows. Caleb knew that whatever had driven them here would not give up easily. And though he'd long ago abandoned any dreams of belonging to a family, he found himself imagining that this time, maybe he could be the shield someone needed. One evening, as thunderheads gathered on the horizon, he saddled his old bay mare and rode to the far end of the property, scanning the tree line. He felt the weight of all their trust pressing on his shoulders, and unexpectedly it felt right. As though this was what the ranch had always been waiting for. Not just a man to tend the land, but a reason to keep watch. He returned just after midnight, the sky cracked open with lightning, the air sharp with the scent of rain. The house glowed softly from the lantern in the kitchen window, and for a moment, Caleb allowed himself to imagine it was his family waiting there for him. Maybe in some unspoken way, it was. Inside, he found Grace curled up in the corner of the sofa, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She looked up when he stepped in, her eyes questioning. He shook his head slightly, reassuring her that he'd seen no sign of trouble, and she offered a small, grateful smile. Evelyn was in the rocking chair, the baby drowsing against her chest. The rhythmic creak of the chair was the only sound as the storm began to hammer the roof. Lila stood near the stove, stirring a pot of soup she'd started hours before. Her hair was loose for the first time, and it made her look younger, softer. "Did you find anything?" she asked, voice low. "No tracks. No vehicles," he said. "The north fence is holding." She nodded, relief mingled with something more cautious. She hadn't yet learned how to trust safety when it looked her in the eye. He shrugged off his coat and hung it by the door. As he crossed the room to warm his hands by the stove, he felt the atmosphere shift. All three women were watching him, though none seemed ready to speak. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her tone quiet but certain. Caleb blinked at her. "Do what?" "Guard us. This ranch. All of it." He studied her face, then Evelyn's, then Lila's. Each bore the scars of a life that had taught them to expect disappointment from men. Yet here they were, meeting his gaze with something approaching faith. "I've been alone a long time," he admitted, voice rougher than he intended. "I'm not sure I remember how to be around people." Evelyn's lips curved in a sad little smile. "You're doing just fine," she murmured. The storm raged until dawn, wind clawing at the eaves, rain seeping in beneath the porch roof. Caleb barely slept. He took up his old rifle and sat by the front window, listening for any sound that didn't belong. From time to time, he caught glimpses of the others moving quietly around the house, checking the doors, whispering reassurances to their children. It struck him then that they were all sentinels in their own way, willing to lose sleep for each other, willing to stay when it would be easier to run. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the ranch washed clean and smelling of wet earth. The children were the first to tumble outside, their laughter bright in the cool air. Grace followed with a basket of linens to hang on the line, her hair lifting in the breeze. Lila and Evelyn joined him on the porch steps. Neither said anything at first. They simply watched the children racing across the yard, shrieking as they leaped over puddles. After a while, Lila drew in a steadying breath. "We won't always need this," she said softly. "Your protection. Your house. Someday, we'll be able to stand on our own again." "I know," Caleb said. "But until then," she hesitated, then reached over to rest her hand lightly on his arm. "Thank you." He looked down at her hand, at the faint constellation of freckles across her wrist, and felt a fierce, unexpected warmth bloom in his chest. The weeks that followed were a slow unfolding of trust. Grace's daughters helped Caleb mend the barn roof, giggling as they handed him nails one by one. Micah discovered he loved the horses and spent hours brushing their coats until they gleamed. Evelyn began to teach Caleb words in her first language, and he repeated them carefully, feeling something thaw in him he hadn't realized was frozen. Some evenings, when the air was warm and the light stretched long across the fields, they all sat together on the porch. Grace would sketch, Evelyn would hum, and Lila would braid her hair while the children dozed in a tangle of limbs. In those moments, the ranch felt like a place apart from time, an island where fear couldn't reach them. But Caleb knew it couldn't last forever. He saw the way Lila sometimes stared down the road, her expression wary. He knew she expected their past to catch up to them eventually, and maybe it would. But he also knew he was no longer the man who would let it happen without a fight. One afternoon, as the sun sank behind the hills, Caleb saddled the mare and rode the perimeter again. He paused at the north fence, watching the road wind away into the distance. There was no movement, no sign of pursuit. But he didn't fool himself into thinking it meant they were safe for good. He turned the mare back toward the house, and as he did, he felt something shift inside him. It was as if the years of solitude were being slowly replaced by a purpose larger than his own survival. He thought of the way Micah had hugged his leg that morning, unafraid. The way Evelyn had smiled when he stumbled over a new word. The way Lila had looked at him, really looked at him, as if she saw a man worth trusting. For the first time in a long while, He felt as though the ranch wasn't just a place he occupied out of habit. It was becoming something alive again, a refuge not only for the lost, but for himself. When the call finally came, it was near midnight. Caleb had been in the barn repairing a latch on the stall door, the lamplight throwing his shadow long against the rough boards. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he strode across the yard and lifted the receiver with a calm he did not feel. On the line was the sheriff of Larkridge, a measured voice, but with an undercurrent of fatigue that hinted at long nights and tangled paperwork. "Caleb," the sheriff said, "I thought you should know. They picked him up this evening. The man Lila was running from. He won't be bothering anyone again." Caleb didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until it came out in a long, unsteady rush. "You're sure?" He was trying to cross the county line. "Multiple warrants. It's over." The words hung in the air like a benediction. For a moment, Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the enormity of them settle in his chest. When he hung up, he stood there in the dim kitchen, listening to the slow tick of the clock. He walked down the hallway, his boots muffled on the braided rugs Lila and Grace had laid out months before. The house was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. He tapped lightly on Lila's door. She answered almost at once, as though she'd been awake all along. Her eyes searched his face. "Something's happened." "It's over," he said simply. "You're safe." She stared at him, her lips parting, her hands coming up to press against her mouth. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she let out a sound, part sob, part laugh, and stepped forward. Before he could think, she had wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face against his chest. He held her, feeling the tremor of her relief and the slow, bright surge of something neither of them had dared name. The next morning, the ranch was drenched in a light that made every blade of grass gleam like new silver. Grace and her girls walked out into the yard as though stepping into a world they had never quite believed was possible. Evelyn stood on the porch, her baby on her hip, and watched the sun climb the sky. Lila came to stand beside Caleb, where he leaned on the fence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "You know," she said finally, her voice soft and a little unsteady, "I used to think that safety was something you had to find in a place. A town. A locked door. But it isn't, is it?" He turned his head to look at her. Her hair was loose, shining in the early light. There were lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but also something luminous, something he realized he wanted to be the reason for. "No," he said quietly. "It's not the place. It's the people." Lila nodded. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough." "You already have," he said. The children's laughter floated across the yard as they chased a wind-blown scrap of cloth. Grace stepped back from the clothesline and lifted her face to the sky, as if she needed to see it to believe it was real. Evelyn came down the steps and joined them, her smile tentative but unguarded. For the first time in years, Caleb felt no ache in his chest when he watched a family gather. Because in some quiet, undeniable way, they had become his family too. Not by blood or any promise spoken aloud, but by the 1,000 small acts of trust and care that had bound them together. Later, as the sun climbed higher and the morning settled into the ordinary rhythms of chores and cooking and children's games, Caleb saddled the mare again. He rode out past the fields, past the tree line where he used to scan for threats. The road lay empty, stretching away into a horizon that no longer looked like a threat, but an invitation. He realized that he had spent so long guarding against loss that he'd forgotten life could also offer a rival, unexpected and profound. When he turned back toward the house, he could see them all on the porch. Lila shading her eyes, watching him return. Grace laughing as she lifted the youngest girl into her arms. Evelyn with her hand resting over her heart, as though steadying something too large to contain. And he thought that maybe this was what his father had meant when he spoke of a man's worth, measured not by the fences he built or the land he owned, but by whether he chose to open his door when the world came knocking. As he rode into the yard, the children ran to meet him, their feet kicking up little puffs of dust. He swung down from the saddle, and before he could say a word, Micah threw his arms around his waist in an unself-conscious hug. Caleb's throat closed. He set his hand gently on the boy's head and looked up at the women standing together in the sun, their faces lifted to him in something that felt like faith. And in that moment, he understood that the ranch had become more than a refuge. It had become a beginning, a place where none of them needed to run any longer, where trust could take root in the unlikeliest soil, where a humble man who had lost everything could find, at last, that he had something left to give, and that giving it could be the finest thing he'd ever done.